Hello, everyone. Welcome to ThinkTech's virtual meetups for the summer season, an initiative organized by the Saudi Ministry of Communications and Information Technology. ThinkTech aims to create a stimulating digital environment and to spread digital awareness about emerging technologies. In this optic, we are happy to introduce you to a series of meetups focused on emerging technologies. Today, we have the session Cybersecurity and the Coronavirus Pandemic. Your moderator and speaker is Dr. Maher Naife, partner at McKinsey & Company. Maher Naife joined McKinsey in 2017 and is a partner in McKinsey's Abu Dhabi office. Maher is a core member of McKinsey's digital practice. He leads the cybersecurity practice in EMEA and leads the industrial cybersecurity service line for the firm. Dr. Maher, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I also would like to introduce a colleague of mine, Jim Boehm. Maybe if you can give us a few words about yourself, Jim, and our past experiences.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Maher. So my name is Jim Boehm. I'm a partner in our Washington, D.C. office. I started my career by doing government-related cybersecurity and defense work, and then moved actually from there to Morgan Stanley and worked at the bank for about a year and a half, and then came to McKinsey & Company after that. Primarily served clients on topics of cyber risk, so migrating from maturity-based to risk-based techniques, and then most recently led our firm's response from a COVID perspective to helping secure work-from-home environments for various clients. And we've been doing that almost full-time since March. So very, very glad to speak with all of you today and really welcome your questions in the conversation. So, and thanks, Dr. Maher, for inviting me.
No, my pleasure, Jim. Thanks. I think, Jim, as you mentioned, I think one of the big things, with this corona epidemic and all of the issues that we've seen out there, this has been like a big shock to many organizations as they scrambled to kind of figure out what to do, as nobody could go to work. And then all of a sudden, everybody was forced into this mode of work from home, prepared or unprepared. It just had to happen. And you mentioned this has been keeping you pretty busy as well. Can you maybe give an idea about, maybe some of the discussions you've had, across industry? I know you've worked a lot with both CIOs as well as CISOs on the topic and kind of figuring out, maybe some of the war stories or some of the things that you've seen. I think it would be really great to, just to give people an idea of what changed, what happened, and then, how have people thought about this as they move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a couple of statistics that for me, I think just really drove a lot of the urgency around this. Very quickly after the pandemic really got bad, so early March timeframe, at least here in the United States, employees were reporting upwards of 70%, so 70-80% of employees were reporting that virtual connectivity was not only critical for their current role, for their current tasks, but also that about that same number, so roughly 75% of folks were first-time established digital users. So roughly the same percentage of people who were reporting it as critical to be able to continue their work were reporting that this was really the first time that they had engaged in digital capabilities at scale and persistently. Of course, what that ended up meaning is that companies were scrambling to get digital capabilities up and online. And video conference is the most obvious of those, but even things like content sharing platforms, enabling access to different vendors to be able to continue to access data or development environments, et cetera. And so the shift that we saw, at least on the corporate side, was not surprising to anyone, I think, on this call, because we've all experienced it, which is a dramatic shift to digital all at once, all at the same time, and with a whole lot of folks who it was really their first time in engaging in digital, ways of working in at scale. And we can talk about the threats here in a minute, but I don't know if you've got any reflections from the region on what that shift was like, there locally.
No, I think that it was a big change, and I think everybody, as they were scrambling, I think what was interesting, and I work, a lot with manufacturing industrial, was, the whole idea of how do you maintain operations remotely. I mean, the whole idea kicked in around creating islands, right? How do we keep people that are clean and keep them on site to keep operations running? How do we remotely support? And all of a sudden, just the breadth of the types of issues that organizations were starting to face on trying to maintain continuity of operations, trying to think about, how do you actually ensure that you can keep your environment secure, but keeping people able to work and get access to the information that they needed. So this was a big issue. And I think maybe, Jim, one of the things that, we also saw, as, good, attackers they always take advantage of a great opportunity. Maybe give us an idea. I know we've done you've seen a lot of statistics on that, and I think there's been a lot written about it in general. But what happened? Did anything change in the way that people were operating, the attackers, or did things pretty much stay the way they were, and it was just kind of more, business as usual for them?
It was interesting. So things happened very quickly, although it wasn't in all the ways we expected. So we expected the number of attacks to go up dramatically, and at least for the first several weeks, that actually didn't happen. The nature of attacks shifted. So almost everything became COVID related. I think there was a statistic that said that towards the end of February and into March, something like 85% of new malicious websites and malware that were introduced to the broader internet were related to pandemic themes. I know that Google blocked in April over 18 million different centrally blocked. So like being delivered to like Gmail users, for instance, 18 million individual different COVID related phishing emails. Wow. So the first dramatic shift was people moving from all of the other attack patterns that they would normally employ to things that were COVID related. That was only the first shift. We did start to see in April and then into May and even into June, that was when the number of attacks really started to go through the roof. So at first, we didn't see a top line increase. We saw a shift towards more pandemic topics. But then as people continued to work from home, as more and more people themselves became out of work or had some kind of like risk of losing their income on the horizon, we did see a top line increase in attacks. So hackers, I think, have pivoted twice over the last several months in pretty dramatic ways. The first towards the themes, and then the second towards the number of attacks. And this is really concerning because there was some research that came out that said that home networks are 3.5 times more likely to have at least one malware family resident on devices connected to that home network as devices connected to corporate networks. And so not only were the themes presumably more effective and the numbers really went up, but you're having much higher incidence of those malware families living on home networks and therefore presumably infecting corporate devices as in a corporate environment. So, companies, I think rightfully so, were very concerned early on about trying to identify and manage a lot of these security risks.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I mean, in general, what happens is, sometimes we get comfortable as, security professionals where you think you're kind of sitting within your perimeter and you have your fence around you and you can keep all the bad guys out. And the reality is, in this world today, you're never really in that mode anymore. Anytime you're on your phone, anytime on your laptop. And then now when you basically introduce home networks with all, whatever else is there, which is really no different than being on a Wi-Fi network. It could be
right.
Almost.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's all part of the process. We got a question, Jim, and I think it kind of ties into what we had talked about at the beginning, which is really around, as you move quickly to adopting technology, does that create a higher possibility of more cyber attacks? I think this is an interesting one because this was fundamentally what was happening. Everybody was moving into, hey, we got to do, let's set up a cloud environments, let's do all of these things. And we need to, collaboration tools, et cetera. I guess the question is, what did we see? So how did, we talked about what happened with the threat actors. Maybe you can walk through kind of like the timeline of the CIO and the CISO as they were asked to open up their infrastructure, and then kind of, oops, we shouldn't have done that. Oops, let's fix this kind of environment.
Yeah.
Maybe give some good examples of what you've seen, across some of the clients you were working with.
Yeah, this was a really hard problem. I think that the CIOs, I think, were the ones that I was really sort of closest to, and therefore had the most, maybe you would say, sympathy for, because they were getting hit with what we started referring to as the dual mandate. And the dual mandate, or the dual mission, was they had to continue supporting continuity of operations. You couldn't just shut business down, right? Employees still needed access. You had to talk to customers. For the financial health of the business, revenue needed to continue coming in. At the same time, there were a whole new host of threats, different kinds of threats that in many cases companies already knew about, but had a harder time mitigating because they didn't have monitors deployed on, you may not have a security operations agent deployed on a bring your own device, for instance. And so I think that, the question is a great one, and it's true generally. If I go introduce a new mobile app, and before I didn't have one, just the introduction of that new mobile app has opened my enterprise up to new digital pathways for attack. If I introduce a credit application or an application for some type of a feature, and I introduce that in an online way, I've introduced a new mechanism for an attacker to come in and steal data or disrupt my business. And so, I think that the question is spot on. As we continue to have more digital capabilities, as we have more digital features, as we have more, digital infrastructure, we definitely open ourselves up to more digital-based attacks. I think what was notable about this situation is it happened so fast, and it happened while businesses were also and continued to be under intense pressure to keep up some kind of continuity of operations. You saw CIOs and CISOs, so CISOs, giving waivers or making exceptions for things they would have never given in the past. And in many cases, the reason I was sympathetic to those conversations is because they didn't really have a choice. You couldn't just say, don't talk to customers. You couldn't just say development has to stop, or vulnerabilities can't be remediated because we're shutting down virtual access. So definitely, as more digital capabilities get involved, and get introduced, absolutely more security concerns come up. But the real question that you have to answer is, how do I mitigate those, not how do I stop them or prevent them? Because in some ways, the only way to sort of prevent digital risk is to stop going digital. And the world that's not the way the world's working.
Yeah, and we saw that some people embraced the challenge and kind of accelerated through it. I think one of the things that'd be, which I've seen in, I've had discussions with clients and where they've looked for help with just basic things that you would typically be able to do, right? You have set up your ability to push your patches out.
Mm-hmm.
You're very much managing your endpoints, but they were basically saying, look, we just can't get them out. The networks aren't there.
Yep.
We can't support it. So then they had to start becoming very creative. One of them said, you know what we started doing, instead of doing our traditional push the patch at midnight to all of our devices where the networks were just failing and they couldn't support it, that they were making smaller patches, they were round robining. Yep. So everybody became very, very creative in this whole process of trying to keep operations as normal as possible while being very flexible. As you said, making waivers on things. And so do you think, as we've transitioned now, everybody I think is hoping that this, it'll be over next week and it'll be over next month. And I think,
I at least hope it's over by the time my kids have to go back to school, because I don't know how much more that I can take.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think the question now is, what is the new normal, right? I mean, are we going back to kind of the way we did things, like where organizations, I mean, like, as you know, there were typically organizations that would be very limited in how they provide remote access. Everybody is like in a plant or an operations center. Everybody physically comes there. You have to punch in and you have to sit at your desk and you work. You had other organizations that were a little more open. And then you had organizations like the Googles and the more of the traditional tech companies that never really thought of a home office as a general concept. Where do you see us moving? I mean, because everybody was forced into some form of this remote working. Do you think people are going to go back? Do you think people are going to stay? And then what does that mean to organizations from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, again, great question. So, I think in order to talk about what comes next, in some ways it's helpful to talk about what companies did, because that, I think, puts down markers for the journey that we've been on. So, the first thing that companies did is they would address and knock down these hot spots, right? They would grant a waiver. Well, that's now something that I need to go follow up on. They would then fix and sort of mop up some of these problems that they found or vulnerabilities, and they would fortify the gains, right? They would then build around these capabilities, better security. I think what's informative about that is the companies that did that the best were the ones that really partnered with what you would consider non-traditional security partners or non-traditional security stakeholders. So folks in IT, folks in the business, they've always been important from a security standpoint, but going in, instead of trying to close all the vulnerabilities themselves in an application, going and teaching application developers how to read Fortify scans or Qualys scans, and then giving them the tools and the capabilities to remediate those vulnerabilities on their own. So I think that as you look forward to the next normal, I think there's going to be a couple of hallmarks that are going to continue to be true. One of the things I hope we don't go back to is the notion of security being security's problem, right? This is your job. You manage this. I'm going to manage the business. I'm going to manage the environment. You manage security. We're all in this together, right? If I'm a business leader and I log into Zoom and I'm having an important conversation with a customer, or even an unimportant conversation with a customer, and somebody who shouldn't be on that Zoom logs in or listens in or Zoom bombs me, that's as much my problem as it is the security team's problem from a risk perspective, because I've put that reputation, I've put that relationship, I've put that conversation at risk, right? So one of the things that I hope we see more of in the next normal, and the companies we've seen lean into this, we've started to see, I think, are accelerating past those that haven't, are clients where they really think about embedding security into the way of working for frontline teams, for developers, for those who configure infrastructure. So that it is much more seen as a team sport rather than something that the security team is responsible for doing.
Do you think on that same note, I mean, when you say it's a team sport, I think sometimes, as you said, the responsibility seems to just be put on one group. And it was a similar, when, the whole, like many organizations, one point everybody's moving to Zoom, then Zoom's not secure. Then we move to, everybody moves to Teams and whatever those things are. And you find all of these different people and, because things are changing quickly. What is it that we've seen, how do organizations think about actually the responsibility of the users? Right. So, how do we help bring awareness around what you can and cannot do? Right. So, like many organizations, I think this was, brought up quite a bit of issues around people using uncontrolled tools, using different types of messaging applications for work-related things, not using necessarily the internal tools that were there. How do we kind of, bridge that gap so that people understand that everything that you do in the digital world, even in the COVID world or pre-COVID world or the next normal, is that, all of these things everybody's responsible. And what have you seen around kind of increasing that awareness and kind of trying to get that responsibility that it's really everybody's problem? As you said, it's a team sport. How have you seen that starting to evolve?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think it's a great question because when we talk about things being a team sport and changing behaviors, we often think about training. Think about going to the front line, giving people capabilities, giving them tools, building awareness, and that's absolutely true. But that's only one part of the answer. Building capabilities is only one of really 4 things you have to do to drive that kind of change. The other things that you have to do is you have to help people understand why it's necessary. It's not enough just to give them the tools. They have to understand the nature of the threat. They have to understand the risk to the business. They have to understand the risk to their own position. If we lose this part of the business because it gets compromised, that's going to impact me personally. So they have to understand the why. The next thing they have to do is they have to see their leaders role modeling that same type of behavior. So if I'm talking about not clicking on phishing links, for instance, yes, I need the capabilities to recognize a phishing email. I need to understand why it's important. I don't click on that link. But I also, if we publish results of click-through rates and phishing tests, I need to see my leaders beating me, because that tells me that that is a marker of success in my company or in my organization, that I'm good at what I'm doing. That ties very closely to the 4th thing, which is incentives. So that's the part that I was saying, it goes up and down the chain. When we think about changing behaviors, we think about training people, and you have to do that. But we also have to set the right mechanisms, the right incentives in place to where we reward people who do well. So if I'm a product owner and I own a development team, and that development team is writing code, maybe there is a very small, but still something, a very small cash bonus that is paid to me every time we run a build process for a new feature that comes back clean of vulnerabilities. Or maybe if I get my vulnerability remediation timeline, down below or within SLAs, whatever the SLAs are, again, maybe there's some sort of an incentive that drives my behavior. That's the part that goes up the chain, so to speak. So when we think about getting people to do the right things, it's really important to build those capabilities. It's important to provide that training, but it's also important for leaders to explain the why. It's important for leaders to role model the right behavior. And it's important for leadership as an institution to incentivize the behavior that we want to see.
Jim, I think you're, somebody's asked a question. I think it's a really nice segue, because I think, fundamentally, as you said, everybody has a role, everything from the leadership all the way down to the frontline person to the technical cybersecurity team. Fundamentally, the majority of people are not cybersecurity professionals.
Yeah. Right.
And, you and I, who've come from working many years in the security space, also are very paranoid, and we probably think and act very different than most people. And probably what we would consider not safe, most people have no idea why we would think of it that way.
Yeah.
How do you get people to recognize, and same with the leadership, right? Because leadership not necessarily are coming from a security background, and it can be frustrating.
Yeah.
What's your advice on how for people that aren't professionals in this space, what are markers? Maybe what are the right questions they should ask, right? So if I'm a manager and I have people working from home, what are the things that I should remind them about that, while working from home, you need to think about these type of things? What are the right types of places, or the things, the clues or the kind of indicators that I should be thinking about, or markers I should be considering as a non-professional in this, as I'm dealing with all of these changes?
Yeah, I think what I've found to be really interesting as we go work with clients, we have a cyber culture survey that we run in clients to help them improve on these types of things. One of the things that I always find striking is that employees genuinely want to do the right thing. Yeah. They really do. They may not be professionals. They may not understand all of what it means to be under attack or a threat or what to respond, but they want to help keep their institution safe. And they do that almost intuitively because they understand that if the institution is at risk, at some level, their own livelihood is also at risk. So they have almost an intuitive desire to do the right thing. The problem is they don't know how, right?
Yeah.
So I'll use a personal example. My wife is a doctor. She's a very good doctor, not a security professional. She has the worst passwords of any person I've ever met. And I used to I can't believe you'd use that password. This is such a terrible password. And finally one day she said, well, how do you know it's a terrible password? And so I went to the website where you can type in your password and it tells you the strength in terms of, number of years. And I'm sure there's some exaggeration, but she said, oh, that's really interesting. Well, let me try this one. Well, let me try this one. And once I showed her how she could get to a stronger password, the only adoption barrier that she had to get past was just a lack of understanding of what made a strong password. Right. So if I use that in a corporate context, if I'm a manager or I'm a security professional and I want people to have strong passwords, it's one thing for me to tell them, write a strong password. It's another thing for me to say, you have to have an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, a special. It's another thing for me to say, here's examples of weak passwords. Here's examples of strong passwords. Don't use these, right? Because then they become weak passwords, but maybe you can write a password by using a combination of letters and numbers and special characters, etc., to write something that is about this length with about this variety of the different types of characters. And I really show them, I teach them how to do that thing is important. There's of course another part of this, which is I have to pick very deliberately what I'm going to teach and what I'm just going to do.
Yeah.
I don't try to teach my wife how to configure our home router.
Yeah.
I just do that myself, right? So there is also a dynamic where you have to say, what are the frontline practices for non-security professionals that they should take on? And I can show them how. And then what are the things that I need to partner with them and do for them or do with them to be able to provide an extra level of security, because that's not really something they're going to be incentivized or able to do because there's an actual capability. So you have to sort of understand, is it capability or understanding?
But I think, as you said, I think some of this is, there's a little bit of a demystifying, because I think, as you said,
that's right.
Fundamentally, it's not intuitive to understand what is weak and what is strong. And many times you think of when you get that, you're typing in a password and you're waiting for the green checkbox to say that you've done everything you needed to do. It gets frustrating and you get annoyed and you don't remember what the password was. And so there's a lot of these things, as you said, of having people kind of have a better feel for why you need to do and what makes it strong or weak, and what are you really trying to defeat. Maybe switching gears a little bit. Everywhere, big push around, we need to move to the cloud. We need to think about, everybody, before, it's stunning. You get startled when anybody calls you anymore, right? And you have a meeting and it's actually a conference code versus a Zoom call. Right. How is this changing the way that literally I had an invite and I'm looking on the computer and then I realized, oh my God, it's actually a phone call. And it was like something startling. It's just, I don't even remember what that was like anymore. But we are now moving to the cloud, right? That's Organizations have made that shift. And, and fundamentally, when people think of cloud, they just think it's insecure. Fundamentally, it's no longer with me, it's now out there. Yeah. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about, how has that transition actually happened? And are we less secure being in the cloud versus being on-prem? Or what are the things that organizations have had to do to kind of manage that? Do you put everything out in the cloud, or do you keep some of it at home? Yeah. What is that logic or process, as we've shifted that way?
Yeah, it's another great question. So when I think about moving to the cloud, the way I like to think about it is putting it's almost like it's like a storage facility, right? And we have these, here in the US, but it's like, someplace I can go put my things, but I maintain the access. It's my stuff that I have to make sure if I, don't want it to get wet, I have to put it on platforms, et cetera. So when you think about shifting to the cloud is fundamentally a business decision, right? It's a decision to improve cost. It's a decision to improve, legitimate user access. It's a decision to be able to have a dynamic ability to up and down scale your compute power, et cetera. So in many ways, when people talk about going to the cloud or they think about going to the cloud, the very first thing to sort of understand and accept is that ultimately it's a business decision. If the business wants to take stuff to the cloud, they're going to take stuff to the cloud. The second thing to understand is that it may go live somewhere else, but it's still fundamentally yours. It's your application and your application controls that you configure. It's your access management capability and the way that you interact with that application. Now, there are some controls, physical controls, that the cloud service provider will provide around their data center. But a lot of the logical controls, those still are things that you control. Now, depending on your cloud service provider and the type of application, maybe you'll hold encryption keys, or you'll have to give up the encryption keys, et cetera. So there are always some nuances, but by and large, it's up to you to configure the controls. So you're not really giving up control in the way that a lot of people think. The third thing is that it doesn't have to be a static decision. So there can be certain portions of, at the end of the day, it's all engineering. There can be certain portions of certain applications that you keep on premise in-house. There can be certain portions that you put in the cloud for, again, expanded compute power, expanded storage, et cetera. And so when you talk about, when companies talk about moving to the cloud, a lot of times it's framed as though it's an all or nothing decision. And at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be. You can make decisions to move things. If your risk appetite is very low and you don't want to take a lot of risk, then start by moving relatively non-risky applications or capabilities into the cloud. If your risk appetite's a little bit higher, then you can do larger moves. But it's something that can be fixed over time, and that can be, again, tied very closely to the needs of the business as sort of the entry point to that kind of a decision. And again, in most cases, you're not really giving up your security control. You're just learning how to manage those controls. Security capabilities of different cloud service providers are in some ways very different. And so those are all considerations that you have to have, but don't have to themselves be blockers or barriers.
I think you touched on an interesting point there. And maybe as we go, I think fundamentally, right, and you and I know this very well, cyber is just, it's another risk dimension.
That's right.
And, and a lot of people focus on the technology side, which is true, but in essence, it's a risk. And it's a way to think about, how you think through your business and what is your risk appetite. And based on that risk appetite, you will do certain things. I mean, in reality, if I wanted to be as secure as possible, I just disconnect from the internet completely and I just work within myself. Yeah. I mean, that basically says, hey, I'm secure, right? Nobody's going to be able to attack me. I'm kind of sitting within my world. But the reality is that's not the way the world works anymore, all right? And you need to interact with this world. But I think, fundamentally, we've seen a change, right? So there has been a shift. A lot of people have thought about security. One, we always thought about put up as many walls as possible and try to keep all the bad guys out. And, and people have spent a lot of money, right? I mean, there are people out there selling hardware, software, you name it, right? And people in their homes have spent all kinds of money on this stuff. And the reality is, and you know this just as well as anyone, if I really, really, really want to get access to your infrastructure and I have the time and the money to do it, I will. And it's just the reality. So where do you start then? Is it really now, can we keep thinking about just keep the bad guys out? Or do we think about, all right, what, and the reality is too, is I can't do everything, right? So how do you think about this now, right? You've got, and especially what happened with COVID, right? So even that maybe false sense of security that I have everybody within my, on my premise, in my Wi-Fi world, on my network, what do you do? How do organizations really start thinking about this in a very, how do I get the most bang for my buck, get the best out of my resources, and try to optimize across all of these things that are completely kind of uncontrollable?
Totally. Yeah. I think you've started the conversation in the right place, which is, sometimes we'll go talk to companies and they'll say, well, how do I get rid of my cyber risk? Well, exit the business. I mean, if you don't want the risk, right, get rid of it. So if you start from a premise that the business or the institution is going to continue working, and you accept the premise that at least some of that way of working is going to be through digital means, right there you're engaged in the conversation of cyber risk. And you have to just at some level accept that. So then the question is, well, how do you move beyond that, right? Okay, so I've accepted that I'm going to take on cyber risk. I think another interesting way to frame it is there really isn't such a thing as cyber risk per se. There's business risk that happens in the digital world, and we call that cyber risk. But when I talk about the chance of losing something of value, when I talk about risk, I'm talking about fraud, the chance of losing money. I'm talking about data leakage, the chance of losing data, right? Fraud, data leakage, operational availability, these are all business risks.
Correct.
So I think the second thing that's helpful to think about is that when you're talking about cyber risk, you're really just talking about business risk that's happening in the digital realm or in the digital domain. So then that leads you to the third part, which is how do I best secure that digital domain? Well, not all technology in a company is equal. There are routers and switches which handle more data than other routers and switches, for instance. There are servers which handle more payment files than laptops. So the next evolution is then to say, there are parts of my environment that are disproportionately risky. They have way more risk than other parts of my environment. And you focus your digital controls on those areas first and at the highest level. Right. So we talk about mitigating cyber from a risk-based perspective. What we're talking about is identifying the sources of value or the sources of impact, and then focusing my controls in those areas so that I can try to frustrate attackers or frustrate other types of threats, because I know that's where they're going, right? The old joke is, well, why do people rob banks? It's because it's where the money is. Same thing, right? If I want to prevent fraud, I should go secure my payment systems. If I want to prevent data leakage, I should go secure my databases. And so as you're working through the process, it's first understanding that you can't exit the business, then understanding that you're going to continue working in digital ways. So then the next part is, what are the areas of my business that drive the most risk digitally? And how do I go secure those first? How do I go secure those in a prioritized way? Through accesses, through security operations monitoring, through hardening, through patch management. I don't have to stop every attacker from gaining access to my environment. What I want to stop is them being able to execute the risky behavior that they want to execute. Stealing money, stealing data, taking systems down.
I think what was interesting, I was talking to some people that I know that are actually come from the hacking world. And they said, the reality is that it's probably more important to be able to watch what's going on.
Yeah.
And watch the things that you care about the most. I mean, like, for example, you can see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, right? And it's sitting right there in front of you. And if you really wanted to, you could make a run for it and grab it, right? The reality is that they got so many cameras and so many people watching it that they'll catch you before you can get out the door.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of what you were basically implying, is that in reality, the idea is understanding what you value the most and then being able to pay attention to it and make sure you're monitoring that. Because, and I get frustrated sometimes when I hear professionals say that, we've done all this cybersecurity, we put all these controls in, and then somebody clicks on that phishing email. I mean, can you really blame them on that? I mean, in reality, you probably have. So the question then is, how do I basically prepare for that occurrence versus blaming it on somebody else and saying, I've done everything that I'm responsible for, and there's nothing I can do about, employees that just don't know any better. And I think that's really the challenge, right? And the challenge now is no longer saying, can I keep you out? The question is can I keep you, as you said, from doing what you want to do when you get in? Right. How fast can I catch you? And how fast can I keep you from executing your plan?
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think when we talk about cyber, people, even though we talk about the fact that it's not about building the walls higher, we still think about cyber very much in the realm of preventative controls.
Yeah.
In many cases, when you're talking about risk management, and I think one of the best examples that I've seen in recent years, in the last several years anyway, is Maersk Shipping Lines, who of course fell prey to the NotPetya attack.
Yeah. They
got hit really hard and they got taken offline in a bad way, but they reacted very quickly and very directly. In fact, there was a story we heard from one of the executives where they had even non-IT people literally running around the corporate spaces, just ripping Ethernet cables out of the wall. And then they would boot those laptops up or those computers up one by one and either verify if they were clean or clean them and mark them with a Post-it note. And that's how they brought their network back online. And it seems a little ridiculous, right? That's how they managed that process. But the fact of the matter is they acted very quickly and very decisively. And then they were very methodical at how they came back online and very careful about the sequence they went in.
Right.
And because of their actions, yes, they got hit. Yes, they had a major risk breach, or they had a major breach incident, but they still survived as a company. And in fact, the market rewarded them from a stock price perspective because they came back online so effectively that, of course, they were not only able to preserve their business, but it was a very strong signal to the market that from a risk management perspective, they were actually quite good.
Yeah.
Okay, so they had some stuff to learn on the security side, but they were very effective at the risk management aspect of it because they were able to react so quickly. And that's in fact, when we go in and go do transformations with clients, oftentimes we'll start with the incident response capabilities.
Yeah.
Because over the course of a 6-month program or something like that, something bad can happen at any time. And you want to be ready for that to mitigate the risk outcome. And then you can build in the other controls as you need to over time.
Yeah, and I think that's now the new reality, right? As you said, people have moved away from the identify, protect, and if you go talk to clients and they're always talking about you respond and recover and detection, then you know that they've actually moved out of that kind of the more kind of I'm just basically trying to plug holes, right? Versus let me just basically do the best I can on this side, but let me really make sure I'm ready on this side. I think, Jim, we have a question somebody asked, and I think this is something that you pay attention to quite a bit. And I spend a lot of time on this topic working with big organizations that have large footprints globally. The whole idea of third party, right? And third party vendors, and it comes in all kinds of forms, right? So you can everything from the guy that's maintaining your AC unit to the outsourcing of an IT professional, or whatever those different models are of how people are leveraging in this new world of third-party vendors, outsource, in-source, whatever. How do you think about that problem? I mean, I think this is one that used to never be on the radar, but now it's clearly, on the radar because you just don't know who's walking the hallways anymore. You don't know where they're coming and where they're going.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
On third-party vendor, and how do we actually think about, advising clients on that specific threat, right? And kind of what's the logic that you should follow in trying to understand what that threat is from a third party?
Yeah, this is an awesome question. And the reason is because, as you've said, not only are we more digitally dependent, but we are very dependent, not just on our vendors, but on those vendors' vendors. Sometimes we call this the 3, 4, 5 problem. I hire a vendor, that vendor is also hiring subcontractors. And I may have almost no insight into my vendor, but I have basically zero insight into my vendor. So then the question is really a twofold question. The first is around segmentation, and the second is around what I'll call pressure. So from a segmentation standpoint, it's very similar to the risk conversation we were having earlier. There are certain vendors which drive more risk in your organization than others. The AC vendor is important, but you maybe only have to secure one portal of where the payments come in, for instance, rather than a vendor that provides software development services and they have 500 people deployed in your organization with all levels of access, right? So from a vendor management perspective, we were working with one client. We asked them how they manage their vendors from a security perspective, and they said, well, we work through our list alphabetically so that we get to every vendor every 18 months or so. And it just really struck us as not a highly effective mechanism for prioritizing how often people were going through reviews. Yeah. You know, ideally you would see those vendors that have access to critical data, access to critical systems, direct access to payment platforms, going through some sort of security review every several months, maybe once a year. And then others, you know, every couple of years, or maybe even just when they're onboarded, right? So that's the first thing, is segmenting based on risk is really important. The second is pressure. I was working with one client in South America, and they had many problems with vulnerabilities being introduced into applications by contract developers. And they said, well, we can't do anything with this company because we can't pick who they send, and based on the terms of the contract, we can't, you know, we can't basically have say over the developers that they send to our company. And we said, well, yes, but in the contract, it does say that they have to send qualified developers. And so you can go ask the company how many of the developers have gone through some sort of security training in the last year. Well, it turns out not very many of them had. And the end result of that conversation is that according to the risk appetite statements for the overall vendor management framework of the company, in the class of developers, they had specified some degree of security capability as being an important qualification for a vendor that was for a development vendor. So the company was able to exert pressure on that vendor to go put the developers through security training at the vendor's cost, because otherwise they had a situation where they could declare breach of contract and recompete the vendor offer. Right. So don't lose sight of the fact that the vendors that you are working with, they're working with you because they either need your money or they like your money, and they don't want that money to go away. And you can use it as a point of leverage after you've identified the vendors that are really important for your environment to be able to go back and have a conversation around capabilities or tools or frequency of security review or the depth of security review that they allow. You can use your contract with them as a point of leverage, and especially if it comes up for recompete, you can even that's a great time to put specific security requirements into vendor contracts so that you may not be able to improve everything on day one, but over time, over a period of 1, 3, 5 years, you can really put greater security requirements on your vendor community to make sure they're in line with your corporate standards.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one of the key things, as you said, fundamentally, is that segmentation up front, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like all the other problems that you have. What's the most important to you? Where do you consider the most value? And then you just have to adjudicate based on that. You know, if you're going to allow somebody to access it, then you have to put in specific controls that will essentially allow you to manage that.
Correct.
And I think that process, sometimes it sounds easier than it is, especially when you have hundreds and hundreds of vendors and a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But it still fundamentally comes back to is what is it that you're most concerned about? And based on that, that's how you then drive the rest of your activities that support that.
That's exactly right.
As you know, we've talked about the different ways of organizations working in this new world. And I think what's interesting is that we're starting to see quite a bit of discussions around, this model, the so-called beyond corp, right? Where, and it's really the reality of forget about the old way of thinking about things. We're perimeterless, and you need to think about kind of just being part of an environment where you have to establish trust among people that you work with. Like, there's no difference between how do I ensure that the person on the other end of this, the computer is actually who they are, et cetera. What's the view that we're seeing, at least in the industry? How are people thinking about that? I mean, there are very progressive organizations like Google that are just completely in that mindset, who have actually coined, they've always been kind of leading the edge on a lot of these kind of dimensions of security. What are we seeing in corporations and other places, the idea of, true remote work because of COVID, and this whole new idea of inside, outside, there is nothing anymore. You're just part of a bigger ecosystem. What are you seeing there? Are you seeing people going that way, or is that really, you've got to be on a different playing field of how you think about technology? Like, you have to be a Google of the world to really be thinking about that. Yeah,
it's a tricky question, because the answer is, so beyond corporate, it's also called zero trust, right? So it's the notion that there's no trust of the environment or the connection that I have, and therefore I need to provide trust some other way, or I need to provide access some other way, right? Most often this is through multi-factor authentication. So something I know and something I have. So I know a password, and I have a mobile device to be able to provide a soft key or something like that. Right?
Yep.
Companies, it's a tricky question, because I would say most companies, at least most large companies I work with, if they haven't at least thought about it, maybe they're even going into pilot or trying to develop and deploy a program. The practical difficulty, though, is that it's just extremely hard. It's very hard to migrate to that kind of an environment, because it requires installation of zero trust or beyond corp capable controls from an architecture and an infrastructure and endpoint perspective universally. And in a world where, practically speaking, most companies do not have a airtight, up-to-date CMDB, or even asset lists, or company roles. I mean, you can always go back to payroll and figure out who you're paying, but what devices do those employees have in sort of the real world? And you also don't have access to limitless numbers of brilliant software developers, right? A lot of companies start to run into implementation problems. Now, what I have seen starting to emerge that I think is highly effective is applying a zero trust or beyond corp type of environment for a new build technologies, or migration of very important technologies, critical technologies, into such an environment. So if I move to the cloud, for instance, that gives me an opportunity not just to upgrade my infrastructure, but it also gives me an opportunity to implement a different type of security. Whereas now I can implement hard multi-factor authentication that is governed by a role-based access type of capability that is something that's dynamically managed by the manager in charge. So now a manager in charge has access to a role-based access capability where I can grant and revoke access or different types of access. And that access is provided by the user by virtue of something they know, a PIN or a password, and something they have, device.
Right.
So I think in many ways, it's highly effective to deploy beyond corp or zero trust capabilities in certain enclaves, and especially as they're being redesigned and redeployed. I think it's very hard for companies to try to implement beyond corp across an entire environment or an entire company in the way that's like Google has, because the scale of the problem is very significant.
Yeah, I think it's probably, as you said, as new technologies getting introduced and all of these things that are happening, I think people are having an eye on that, and it probably will be an evolution that we'll probably move into. I don't think it'll be a revolution, right? I think this will be an evolution as we evolve. I think we have one last question, and I know we actually talked about this early on, and we have a few more minutes. And we talked about it at the beginning, but we never really probably went through it. If you were to talk today about what are the top cyber threats, right? Be it in the COVID world and probably the next world after that, what would you see, or what are we seeing, from engagements with clients, or what are people actually thinking out there are the top cyber threats that, that people should be concerned about from an organization perspective? Yeah,
I would say there's at least three. And these aren't necessarily in order, but there's buckets of things that I talk to clients about. The first is actually talent. People talk about the threat of security talent all the time. People often mitigate that threat by introducing automation and by, again, training capabilities at lower levels. So you relieve pressure off your security team. People talk about the talent threat, again, all the time. The second big threat is actually the pace of digitization and the lack of control that business owners require in those digital capabilities. That is also a huge threat pathway. So if I go introduce a new capability or a new application, if I as a business owner haven't mandated that I have the right security controls in those capabilities, even if it's only a pilot, I've opened up a threat pathway that's pretty dramatic. And then the third is what I would call like your traditional threats, but especially criminal syndicates. So the top, it would be sort of silly for me not to acknowledge that there is a huge external threat presence. It is a business, and they are very focused on making money and having influence. And it employs full-time people for careers. And that threat is very real. And as time goes on, they continue to, as they did at the beginning of COVID, change their tactics to be continuously effective and continuously evolving. And we have to continue evolving with them. But it's an ongoing dynamic, and I don't know that it's one that will go away.
Yeah, I mean, people like myself have lost a lot of hair worrying about cybersecurity and the issues, because it's not I don't think it's a problem that we'll ever catch up to, right? I mean, I think it fundamentally means, the threats are evolving, the technology is moving, and in reality, and you brought up the piece on talent. I mean, there is a global shortage, be it in the United States or in the kingdom. There is a global shortage of cybersecurity professionals that are going to be required to deal with the threats and support where everybody wants to go digitally. It's just where the reality is. So I think with that, Jim, I want to thank you so much for joining me in this discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope the audience did as well. I think we've run out of time. And I want to thank the Ministry of Communication and IT for hosting this session. And I hope this was insightful and valuable to the.
All right. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it, and I want to thank you as well for inviting me.